Part 1, The Standoff in the Neon Glow. The Aftermath of the Grind. The year was 2007. I was Liam Thorne, a lean, focused 23-year-old using grueling armed security shifts to shoulder the financial burden of my criminal justice degree. My graveyard rotation, 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., left me perpetually drained. This particular morning, though my muscles screamed for rest, I had an early bus to catch to Philadelphia to see my friend, Finn. A small token, a cold bottle of obscure, citrus-flavored soda, was the only task standing between me and my car's ignition. My job demanded strict protocol: pistol, belt, holster, and ammunition locked securely in the trunk immediately upon clocking out. Tonight, however, exhaustion led to a catastrophic lapse in judgment. I simply tossed the entire heavy rig, my trusted Sig Sauer P226 included, onto the back seat of my battered, charcoal-gray Ford Taurus. It was a momentary convenience that, in retrospect, would define the next terrifying chapter of my life. The convenience store was a 24-hour beacon of decay in a fringe district of Baltimore, Maryland. It sat anchor to a strip mall where most businesses, including the neighboring dental practice and tax service, were long shuttered. At 3:37 a.m., the asphalt parking lot was a vast, desolate expanse, illuminated only by a single, sputtering sodium lamp that cast everything in a sickly, pulsating orange hue. The cracked pavement and the oppressive silence amplified the feeling of being utterly isolated. I pulled into a spot close to the entrance, completed my mundane purchase, and was walking back, the bottle sweating condensation onto my palm, when the stillness shattered. The appearance and the weapon. She came into view abruptly, scrambling from the deep shadows cast by the defunct professional offices across the lot. She was young, perhaps my age, early 20s, her blonde hair disheveled, her floral print white blouse stark against the gloom. Her eyes were hyperdilated, reflecting the ambient light with unnatural intensity. Terror, raw and uncontrolled, was etched into every line of her face. She was gripping something tightly. "Shit," I whispered, freezing instantly by my driver's side door. The sight of her clenched hand raised my adrenaline sharply. For a paralyzing second, I believed she was holding a firearm. "He's following me," she shrieked, her voice a fragile, frantic wire snapping the heavy silence. She was moving directly toward me, her gait a panicked, stumbling run. "He's following me," she repeated. That's when I heard a rapid, high-pitched crackle. Not a gunshot, but the unmistakable, violent sound of an electrical discharge. What she clutched was a contact-stun gun, the electrode snapping and spitting angry blue sparks into the humid air. Her hands were shaking so violently that the device seemed barely under her control. I managed to maintain a facade of calm, holding my car door open, a ready escape or a shield. "Who is following you?" I asked, attempting to project stability, my eyes meticulously sweeping the vast, empty lot, searching for a second shadow. The air felt suffocatingly dense, thick with silent anticipation. The stalker and the standoff. Then, he emerged. From the same corner where the girl had appeared, a monolithic figure materialized. He was colossal, easily 6'7", with shoulders that strained the seams of his faded blue tank top. His head was cleanly shaved, bald, emphasizing the sheer mass of his neck and arms, which looked less like human limbs and more like the weathered trunks of ancient oaks. In his right hand, catching the weak orange light, was a knife. It was not a concealed blade, but a massive, fixed-blade hunting bowie, its wicked, clip-point profile a promise of savage violence. "That's my piece," he stated, his voice a gravelly, unnerving monotone that contrasted sharply with his imposing physical presence. His eyes were fixed entirely on the girl. I was, to him, completely irrelevant. He walked with a heavy, purposeful scrape of boots on the asphalt, closing the 40-foot gap with chilling inevitability. The girl, now pressed against my car, her chest heaving, whispered, "He's following me. He wants my piece." The situation was instantly clarified, yet impossibly twisted. I pointed toward the store's entrance, a brightly lit rectangle 20 feet away. "Get inside." Now. Tell them to call 911. Since cellular service was unreliable and expensive for me at the time, this was her only immediate hope. She nodded desperately, the stun gun sputtering, and sprinted back toward the safety of the neon-lit interior. The giant kept advancing. "That's my piece," he repeated, a dull, relentless mantra that seemed to drain all meaning from the words. He was 15 feet away, his shadow a long, monstrous caricature stretched by the failing lamplight. My training, honed by an infantry tour in the army where I had navigated the sharp end of close-quarters combat, kicked in. The detached professionalism of a military mindset was my shield. I reached quickly into the Taurus's back seat, pulled out my gun belt, and slapped it around my hips, making sure the polished leather and the dark profile of the holstered 9mm were highly visible. My hand settled on the checkered grip, a silent escalation of force. He did not flinch. He walked closer, the knife's serrations gleaming, the terrifying calm never leaving his eyes. 10 feet. 9 feet. I drew the pistol, bringing it up swiftly, stabilizing my wrist, and placing the front sight dead center on his sternum. "Here's my piece," I articulated, my voice level and controlled, a stark contrast to the thunder in my chest. He stopped instantly. The parking lot was now a tiny, compressed stage defined by the 10 feet between us. His eyes, dark and flat, narrowed, finally acknowledging my existence with a flicker of genuine appraisal. The knife remained raised, a lethal extension of his arm. "I don't want to do this, man. Just walk away and have a good night," I stated, injecting authority into my tone while desperately willing him to comply. I knew the legal and ethical quagmire of a shooting, especially after combat. The last thing I wanted was to end a life over this absurd, grim confrontation. To punctuate my seriousness, I cocked the hammer, the sharp metallic click ripping through the dense silence like a gunshot, echoing the finality of my intent. The subtle threat worked. After a moment of absolute, terrifying stillness, the tension palpable enough to choke on, his composure softened. "Sorry, man," he mumbled, his voice returning to a normal conversational tone, the chilling monotone gone. "Thought you were somebody else. My mistake." He slowly lowered the knife, tucking the formidable blade into the small of his back, and began backing away, retreating not toward the shadows, but toward the light of the convenience store where the girl had vanished. I kept the SIG aimed at his back until he disappeared through the glass doors. Only then did I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the shaking in my hands a delayed consequence of the sudden release. The confirmation and the aftermath. Clutching my untouched bottle of soda, I got into my car and drove across the strip mall to a competing, better-lit 24-hour convenience store, where a sheriff's deputy cruiser sat conspicuously parked. The deputy, a weary man sipping coffee, listened to my account. Before I could complete the description, his posture changed, his expression hardening into professional seriousness. "Bald guy, blue tank top, big knife. The peace man?" "Yes," I confirmed, taken aback. "How did you know?" "He's been a problem for weeks," the deputy stated, already moving toward his cruiser. "Violent disturbances, brandishing that knife, rambling that nonsense about his piece. We've been looking for him." He sped off with a screech of tires, heading directly for the other store. I drove home, the image of the massive, calm figure and the gleaming knife burned into my memory. That careless decision to leave my pistol on the seat was the only reason I had survived the confrontation without having to use lethal force, or, worse, being overwhelmed by the towering assailant. I never received an official update on the girl or the peace man, but the knowledge of how close I'd come to an unthinkable outcome in that desolate parking lot remains a scar on my soul, a brutal lesson in the random, immediate violence lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane. Part 2, The Silent Vigil of the Supercenter. The unsettling routine. I was Rory Evans, a 30-year-old former veteran working a contract for a private security firm in Salinas, California, a sun-baked agricultural hub known for its vast, flat fields and sprawling retail parks. My sector covered a perimeter of several large box stores, primarily revolving around the massive Walmart supercenter. My duties were usually tedious, checking for dumpster divers, shooing away late-night loiterers, and patrolling the colossal, desolate back parking lot, a sea of cracked asphalt stretching towards the distant, empty warehouses. It was March 24, 2019, a Sunday. My shift started at the bleak hour of 6 a.m. The air was frigid, the pre-dawn cold sharp enough to penetrate the thin veneer of my duty jacket. I climbed into the high-riding company pickup and began my routine, circling the perimeter. The back lot was traditionally an automotive graveyard. Since the Christmas rush, it had hosted little more than abandoned shopping carts and a few forgotten, dust-covered vehicles that hadn't stirred in months. As I rounded the far corner, near the seldom-used receiving docks, my headlights swept across a small, pale gray Honda Civic. It was angled oddly, half hidden behind a massive concrete support pillar, tucked precisely between the faded parking stripes. I had registered its presence vaguely over the past few months, dismissing it as an employee's commuter or another weary soul using the Walmart lot as a discreet, temporary refuge. It was common practice, we usually left them alone. But this morning, a distinct, subtle wrongness permeated the scene. The odor and the haze. I stopped the truck about 15 feet away and lowered the window. The cold air rushed in, but it carried a faint, sour, thick odor. It was not the sharp, recognizable stench of decaying refuse from the nearby dumpsters. This was heavier, more organic, a dense, sickly sweet effluvium that immediately caused my stomach to clench. I instinctively recoiled. The car's exterior was telling a different story than its immediate surroundings. The tires were slack, nearly flat, and a network of cobwebs spanned the gap between the rearview mirror and the window frame, a sign of prolonged, absolute stillness. The windows were completely fogged from the inside, streaked with grime and condensation, forming an opaque barrier. The wiper blades had literally fused to the glass under months of neglect. I stepped out onto the cold asphalt, the sound of my boots painfully loud in the early morning quiet. I approached slowly, my radio held ready. "Hello. Security here. Is everything all right in the vehicle?" Silence. Absolute, impenetrable silence. I walked to the driver's side. The dust on the windshield was a thick, uniform film. As I pressed my face close, shielding my eyes from the low, horizontal rays of the rising sun, I saw it, a faint, ghastly outline through the grime. A figure, slumped slightly, resting against the headrest. It was a person. A woman. The unnatural stillness. She was positioned as if asleep, her head tilted back, her hands settled delicately in her lap. Her face, barely discernible through the haze and the density of the tinted glass, was an unnatural, dry grayish color. The absolute stillness of the figure, coupled with the suffocating odor, delivered a cold, immediate jolt of certainty. My world narrowed instantly to the gray car and the terrifying sight within. The distant noise of highway traffic, the cry of circling gulls, all disappeared. I stumbled backward, seizing my radio with a shaking hand. Unit 3 to dispatch. Code 10 to 54. Need police at the supercenter back lot immediately. Possible deceased occupant in a vehicle. My voice cracked with involuntary dread. 10 agonizing minutes later, a patrol car arrived. The officers taped off the perimeter and, with visible caution, approached the car. When the senior officer pulled the handle and forced the driver's door open, the smell hit everyone simultaneously, a potent, concentrated wave that attacked the throat and nostrils, an odor so final and pervasive it seemed to cling to the very air. "Yeah," one officer said quietly, covering his nose. "She's been here a long time. Too long." Detectives and the coroner's van eventually arrived. I gave my statement, watching the grim, methodical process from a distance. The car's windows were covered in tarps to preserve the scene. Eventually, an officer approached me and quietly confirmed the identity. Lauren Cho, 22 years old, reported missing 3 months prior. She had vanished in December, and her car had been sitting in the highly trafficked, ostensibly safe parking lot the entire time. The official conclusion was that she had likely fallen asleep and suffered a non-violent, internal medical event, no signs of foul play, no struggle. A water bottle, her phone, battery dead, and her small purse were found. She had simply slipped away while resting, unseen, during the most frantic, crowded season of the year. The haunting blindness. The utter horror of the incident was not the discovery itself, but the terrible ease of the concealment. Months had passed. Countless employees and security guards, including myself, had driven past, people had parked feet away to shop during the holidays, and the car had remained a silent, ignored tomb in plain sight. The image of her final, quiet repose, the hands folded, the gray stillness of her skin, became an unavoidable fixture in my mind. For weeks, I avoided the far corner, but the sense of unease was permanent. The company eventually towed the Civic after the investigation, but the oil stains and faint tire imprints on the concrete remained, a dark, persistent memorial. The story infected the staff. Everyone remembered seeing the car, everyone recalled dismissing it. The sheer, collective blindness was terrifying. We look for tragedy in the shadows, in the back alleys, in the deep night. But this proved that the most final and frightening things can hide themselves perfectly in the glare of plain sight, among the mundane and the familiar. Now, every night, I find myself compulsively checking abandoned vehicles and dark corners, not for petty crime, but for unseen stillness, for the quiet, forgotten stories hiding in the routine. That day taught me that the biggest threat isn't always the criminal or the trespasser, it's the complacency that lets unthinkable tragedies unfold just a few feet away, unnoticed and unchallenged. Part 3, The Stalker in the Corporate Maze. The Late-Night Labyrinth. I am Andrew Pierce, a 36-year-old data analyst whose 9 to 5 often stretched to 9 to 7, or even later. My office was located in a sprawling, low-rise corporate park on the outskirts of Houston, Texas, a landscape defined by impeccably manicured lawns and an ocean of uniform asphalt. By day, the area hummed with life; by night, it devolved into one of the most eerily quiet, isolated places imaginable, a silent grid under the deep Texas sky. This particular night, a raw, late autumn Tuesday, demanded an all-nighter for a critical logistics report. When I finally hit send at 11:30 p.m., my body felt like concrete. The office, already dim, plunged into absolute darkness when I flipped the final light switch, leaving only the ominous green glow of the exit sign at the corridor's end. I exchanged a weary nod with Sam, the older, amiable night security guard, who was engrossed in a crossword puzzle. The automatic glass doors sighed open, and I stepped into the blast of cold air. The parking lot was a chilling vista. The high, humming sodium lamps cast intermittent pools of sickly orange light over the vast, black expanse. The vast majority of spaces were vacant, creating a confusing, checkerboard pattern of shadows and faint light that warped familiar perspectives. My first stressor was a mundane one: I couldn't remember where I'd parked. Usually, I stuck to Section C, but this morning, I'd been displaced to Section D or maybe E. I clicked my key fob, but the car was too far away to respond. I began my solitary trek across the asphalt, my work loafers crunching softly in the cold silence. The long, distorted shadows cast by the lamps seemed to writhe and stretch at the periphery of my vision. A gust of wind rustled a pile of dry leaves, and the sound, magnified in the deep quiet, made me flinch violently. The primordial unease of being entirely alone in an enormous, dark space was immediate and suffocating. The violation of space. I finally located my dark blue sedan, a simple, unassuming four-door, 2 rows over and 50 yards down, its headlights flashing briefly in response to my fob. A huge wave of relief washed over me. I quickened my pace, my mind already focused on the simple comforts of home. My hand closed around the cold, familiar metal of the driver's side door handle. My thumb pressed the unlock button. And then I froze. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a visual cue. It was a brutal, instantaneous instinct, a biological alarm that screamed at me with absolute certainty: do not enter the car. The feeling was so intense, so overwhelmingly illogical, that I obeyed it without conscious thought. I released the handle, straightened my spine, and slowly, deliberately, turned around. He was right there. Less than 6 inches from my face. My breath fractured in my throat, a silent, strangled gasp. We were in perfect, terrifying proximity, turning toward each other in a bizarre, unexpected synchronicity. My mind went utterly blank, a circuit breaker tripped by the sheer, unadulterated shock of his sudden appearance. He hadn't been there a second ago. I was scanning the entire lot, I would have seen him approach. There had been no crunch of his shoes, no shadow, no distant footsteps. He had simply materialized. The predator's gaze. He was ordinary, average height, gaunt, with an unkempt face and a plain gray hoodie. This very ordinariness was what made him terrifying. His presence was fundamentally wrong. His eyes were wide, dark, and utterly vacant, not focused on me, but seemingly looking through me, as if I were merely a translucent obstacle. His posture was not that of a hurried coworker, it was the tense, coiled stance of a predator waiting to strike. As my heightened senses kicked in, I registered the sour, faint odor of unwashed clothes and the rigid clench of his jaw. Our eyes locked, and in that agonizing moment, I watched a disturbing shift in his expression. It was as if my act of noticing him had surprised him, ruined the choreography. His empty stare flickered, replaced first by confusion, then by a cold, unsettling annoyance. As if my presence had simply become a nuisance, he abruptly broke eye contact, turned sharply away, and walked off without uttering a single word. He didn't run, he walked at a steady, efficient pace, disappearing into the maze of parked cars and orange shadows. I stood there, immobilized, the cold adrenaline surging through my veins, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. I did not get in the car. I turned and ran, sprinting blindly back towards the office building, fueled by a primal, desperate need for light and human presence. I burst through the doors, panting, stammering an incoherent account to a bewildered Sam. The final confirmation. The weeks that followed were defined by low-grade, persistent paranoia. I left work only during daylight, always with coworkers, and avoided the parking lot whenever possible. I rationalized it as a random, startled encounter, a strange man startled by my sudden presence. But about a month later, a server crash forced another late night. I left the building at 9 p.m. with 2 IT colleagues, walking together until they reached their section. I forced a smile and continued the walk alone toward Section D, my keys clutched like a useless weapon. I saw my car from 50 feet away, and my breath hitched. A figure was standing next to the driver's door. It was him. The same gaunt silhouette, the same plain gray hoodie. His back was to me, and his arm was moving in a rhythmic, jerking motion at the door handle. He was actively trying to force open my car door. This time, there was no shock, only a cold, sickening wave of confirmation. He hadn't been a random weirdo. He had been waiting. He knew my car. He was planning to be inside when I returned. I must have made a slight gasp or shuffle, because he froze instantly. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding me across the empty 50 feet of asphalt. The expression on his face was not fear of being caught, but pure, unfiltered rage. He dropped his effort on the handle and his hand vanished into the kangaroo pocket of his hoodie. He pulled out a knife. It was not a large hunting blade, but the simple, sharp, lethal glint of the steel in the orange light was enough to shatter my resolve. He didn't hesitate. He started running. Sprinting directly at me, the small knife held low at his side. I dropped my bag and ran for my life, screaming a ragged, primal noise that tore through the corporate park's silence. I didn't run back to the office's distant safety. I ran toward the lights of the main access road. It was pure, desperate luck. As I stumbled onto the curb of the access road, a pair of headlights swept across me, a county sheriff's patrol car on a routine perimeter check. I waved my arms and screamed, and the cruiser slid to a halt. 2 officers emerged, their weapons immediately drawn. I pointed back into the black maw of the parking lot, gasping my fragmented account, man. Knife, my car. One officer moved cautiously into the lot, but the man was already gone. He had vanished back into the vast, indifferent darkness and the maze of cars. They took my statement, scoured the lot and checked the grainy security footage, which only showed a hooded figure, no clear face, no license plate. They promised increased patrols, but they never found him. I still don't know who he was or why he singled me out. All I know is that the primal, illogical instinct that screamed at me to turn around that first night saved me from a terrifying, calculated encounter in the quiet, isolated heart of a place meant to be the epitome of safety and routine. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.